to hear feedback about someone's work performance is one of the most challenging tasks a leader has, and yet it's the most important thing you'll do. You probably need to get way better at this, and you might be avoiding having a tough conversation or two, but here's help. You've tuned in to Dr. K2, where we talk about how to build trust and influence effectively at work. Feedback conversations are perhaps the most impactful ones you'll have at work, whether you're on the facilitating end of that or certainly when you're on the receiving end. So get it right. Your team is depending on you and quite likely pretty nervous about hearing feedback. First, know the 4-to-1 ratio. What is that? Lots of psychology research tells us that leaders should be shooting for 4 what we call reinforcing examples of behavior to 1 developmental piece of feedback. So that's 4, thank you, please do more of this, to 1, let's look at the impact that this is having and could be better. Reinforcing and developmental, 2 types of feedback. A couple qualifiers here. Some data on what works best on average for millennials and Gen Z recipients places that ratio more at a 5-to-1. And also the ratio certainly changes based on personality. Other organizational dynamics have an impact. But on average, for the US culture, a 4-to-1 ratio is a good target. So just to have that in the back of your brain when it comes to feedback. We're focusing this video on how to deliver what might be hard to hear feedback, but recognize that most of the time you'll be looking for specific ways to applaud behavior that has a good impact. This same process works for either reinforcing or developmental. Now let's dig into the PREBI feedback model. The PREBI model will guide you through the feedback conversation process. Now I'll pause here. You might want to take a picture of this for reference when you need it. P stands for pattern. Do you have 2 to 3 data points related to this piece of feedback? If you have just one, consider whether or not to deliver it. Maybe that person was having an off day. Maybe there are interpersonal dynamics or something else in play that elicited the impact you experienced or observed. Who knows? Just think about it if it's just one data point. Okay, now move to R, which stands for reflection. This is an important step and one no other feedback model I've seen includes. This is where psychology steps fully forward to help you. Ask yourself, is this your own hot button? Do you find yourself reacting with some energy around this behavior when you encounter it across different people, across a variety of contexts? If so, it's likely that this is a personal bias, and you might be engaging in what psychologists call projection, or at a minimum, an overreaction. If I was coaching you, we'd dig into that if it's coming up for you, but just know that it's important to reflect before calling a meeting to share this particular feedback. But don't overthink this, and don't use this step as an excuse to look past what truly could be valuable growth and needed feedback for another person, like a direct report. But just take a beat here. I'll give you an example of this. A client I worked with shared how he noticed when he started using the reflection step that his feedback was often about people being verbose, not succinct enough. Some of this was an occupational necessity. He was in private equity deals in his role, and in fact, this feedback to especially junior associates was often well-founded and helped these folks develop more of a succinct communication style. So it was appropriate feedback. But he was assuming every situation should have very succinct communication from everyone. His awareness of this bias changed his approach to assessing what was feedback worthy and what was not feedback worthy. Think about your own hot buttons. Now you're ready to use the 3 steps that help you have the actual conversation. So you've done the P for pattern, the R for reflection, and now we're into the EBI of PREBI. But before we get to that part, Let's talk about how to ask this person to chat with you. If this is a direct report to you, then hopefully you've set a working norm that expects feedback conversations fairly often. Feedback for you too, by the way, as well as feedback for that other person. And that you've talked about what your direct reports can expect in these conversations. Look for a future video on how to build a growth-oriented yet psychologically safe team culture. Whether you've done things to build such a culture, or you're just maybe at the start of that, or you don't know what I'm really talking about with that, here's how to invite the person into the dialogue. Ask the person if you could share some feedback that may or may not help that person be more effective in their job. Now, we all recognize that this is not a real question. You both know that you're not asking as much as saying you're going to do this, but it's a more respectful way than just launching right in. Ask if now is okay or if another time might be better, but try not to make it a big deal. Now, if you're particularly concerned about how that person will react to this type of conversation, then start with a dialogue tactic I've labeled intent alignment. This is a statement that conveys what you're concerned about in even having this conversation and how you hope this will land. It sounds like this. I'm a little concerned that this type of conversation about how to get better at something might land as really critical, or that it might even somehow damage our working relationship, when in fact, my intention is the opposite. Then stop talking and let that person react or respond. However they respond, what this does is deliver a vaccine of sorts to the conversation that's coming. It helps inoculate it against the type of reaction that you're concerned about. They still might react in ways that worry you or that you may have experienced before with that person, but this way, it's a lot less likely to go that way. I've used this in a lot of different circumstances with feedback delivery as well as with coaching. A lot of my coachees have reported great success with this one tactic, intent alignment. Now remember, this step is only for those people whom you have reason to believe are likely to react in ways you're worried about, not for people or situations where you're fine just getting to it. Now share the events where you observed the behavior or behaviors that you're giving feedback around. Be specific, like at the meeting with the procurement team and again at the meeting with Rachel in finance. You might take a beat here so that that person can recall these events. This is the first time that we'll have had this feedback, most likely. Next, share the behavior that you saw and heard, or the behaviors. It's important to just report on what a video camera would have captured, video camera data. It's important to avoid making assumptions here about what the person felt or intended, like you seemed irritated or you seemed distracted. You really don't know what goes on in someone's emotional or thinking space, what their motives are, so don't assume it. You would hope for the same in return. Most people mess this step up, so work on this. It'll be hard to get the nuance of it, but you'll get the hang of it. Wrap up your feedback sharing with the impact that the behavior had on you. What did you think? What did you feel? Don't forget the feeling part if that's at all relevant at all here. Many people leave that out, and it's critical. It was hard for me to keep track of where you were going, might be what you would say, or I felt anxious and tense. I wondered if others may have felt that too. Okay, now be careful about reporting on how others either did or may have reacted. Stick with the impact on you, unless you have really supportable information on the impact on others. But even then, one of the reasons to be careful here is because it might feel like piling on, especially if it may be particularly hard for this person to take this in. Wrap up the impact piece with an invitation to talk openly about this. Say something like, I'm sure this impact was not your intent though. We're all here to learn, including me. Okay, those two statements are really important. Not your intent, and we're all learning. You might also add, this is just my experience. What was going on for you? Remember that you are just one person in this experience. If you're this person's manager and more experienced, then your feedback does matter a lot. but you're still one person in the assessment of impact, and you don't have their perspective yet. That's partly the reason for this conversation. Ask that person to share their perspective, and remember to use active listening skills when you have this conversation. See a future video about how to actively listen, since these are your very best tools to help you do well in most any important workplace dialogue. A key active listening tactic is summarizing. It's your most important tool. Use it here. Summarize what they say back to you more than once, several times. So you're saying this and you feel this about this. Do I have that right? Let them respond back, get some clarity. Include any feelings that they share. Really listen for those feelings. Validating what someone is feeling is critical to building psychological safety. And that's the team culture that you want. One that is focused on excellence as a team, and you don't avoid difficult to hear feedback when it's necessary, but you're also focused on a top of mind goal, which is creating a psychologically safe place for people to learn and you yourself to learn. If that person is taken aback and wants to speak at a later date, encourage that. Okay, so either now or a later meeting, offer to help that person figure out what they might try to act on with this feedback that they're getting. This is where you need to pull out that coaching model you may have learned in a leadership development program. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, look for a future video on coaching conversations. And that's it. Now you know the PREBI feedback model and tips on how to have these conversations when it's tough conversations to have. It also works well and as well if you're giving feedback that's going to be nice for somebody to hear, but except with the exception of the pattern component. If you have one data point when it's reinforcing feedback, remember that's that kind of feedback that is saying, please do more of this because it's really effective. Run, don't walk to that person and say, that one time this thing happened and I want to let you know. But also move through the reflection piece, move through the EBI part, that's the what you say part, the events, the behavior, the impact, and it all works well for developmental and reinforcing feedback. And as a pro tip, kind of a gangster tip, at the end of one of these conversations, ask the recipient how they felt you did. Show them the picture on your phone of the model that you're working with, this model, and tell them that you're still getting skilled at this. You'll both kind of be together in it this way. And it helps that person to recognize that you also need feedback and that it's okay to have these conversations as they come up for both of you. The people on your team, whether direct reports or peers or your boss, need and want to be really effective. Know that. So feedback conversations need to happen. Both the thank you, do more of that kind of feedback, as well as the let's look at the impact of this and adjust that probably kind. So you're doing really important work with delivering feedback and going at it with self-reflection and care in how it's delivered. The best kind of feedback, by the way, is the kind someone has asked for, the kind focused on the skills someone wants to use more of or are getting better at and are motivated to do so. To learn more about how to do that for yourself as well as for others so that your performance feedback lands really well, see the pop-up here for a link to a video on that. View the video notes to subscribe to the Dr. K2 channel and find me on LinkedIn for more help on how to build trust and influence effectively at work. Thanks for joining me.